Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the War for BADAB, where the final fight is before us. As Stibor Lazarek's radical plan to break open the Ring of Steel by tossing a piece of a sun at it has proven remarkably effective, though the chapter master of the Firehawks does not get the full credit for the success of this stellar plan. Oh no, a considerable portion of the credit has to go to the tyrant himself, who entrusted the entirety of the command and control systems of the Ring of Steel into the hands of a single Astral Claws captain, Corian Sumatris, aboard Sentinel Sigma. The tyrant's lack of trust had cost him his single greatest remaining strategic asset, a military objective that quite likely would have cost the Loyalists the near entirety of their offensive power to breach, was now destroyed with a single button press, as the key cogitators aboard Sentinel Sigma were seized and then broken into by the Magosses of Angstrom, which gave complete command authority over the ring over to Carab Cullen. As the tyrant stood on the balcony of the Palace of Thorns, I do wonder if enough of his rational mind remained to recognize this fact, as he stared up into the sky, high above where he could see the detonation of tens of thousands of nuclear warheads as his extensive minefields self-destructed. But whilst the breaking of the Ring of Steel had come at phenomenally low cost to the Loyalists, it had nevertheless compromised a linchpin part of their plan for the invasion of BADAB Primaris. The Rex had been intended to be the bulwark that would shield the rest of the Loyalist fleet as it moved into low orbit above the Astral Claws capital world, still bristling with anti-orbital defenses. The Firehawk's venerable vessel was the only one expected to be able to brave that firepower and live to tell the tale. But after its recent escapades of towing a few 100 billion tons of burning plasma across the cosmos, the Rex's engine blocks and plasma drives had seen better days. The damage was extensive, and if it was ordered into low orbit now, it would never leave again. But as a wise old military philosopher of ancient terror once said, no plan ever survives contact with the enemy. And retreat was most assuredly not an option. So even as the Loyalist Armada was heading towards BADAB Primaris, Carab Cullen and his military council was meeting via hololithic projection to work out a new assault plan against the tyrant's capital. There were three primarily identified objectives. The first was the Fortress Monastery hanging in high orbit above BADAB Primaris, the old headquarters stations of the Warders. Like all of its kind, it was ferociously heavily armed and armored, though the centuries had seen its status degraded significantly. It had once been the primary defensive station for the entirety of the system, but with the creation of the Ring of Steel, its strategic and tactical importance had waned vastly. It was expected, no doubt, to primarily act as a long-range supporting fire platform, and so it was viewed as unlikely for the Tyrant to have placed any significant number of Astral Claws on board. In the original plan, the Raptorus Rex would soak up any firepower that the station could put out, whilst also engaging surfaced targets, leaving the rest of the Loyalist Armada free to engage the platform at their leisure, either boarding it or simply hammering it into scrap metal with concentrated broadside volleys. Now that the Rex was out of the picture, however, such a lackadaisical approach could no longer be tolerated. The massive guns of the Fortress Monastery had to be silenced, and as swiftly as possible. The shortest way to achieve this would be via boarding action. This was not the optimal scenario, as it would reduce the number of Astartes available for an assault upon the heavily defended surface of BADAB Primaris. But again, no plan ever survives contact with the enemy and all that. The Star Phantoms volunteered to dedicate 2 companies to the station's subjugation. To further augment the Star Phantoms, the Firehawks and the Sons of Medusa also volunteered smaller contingents of assault specialists to aid in the task. And so, the Warder's old Fortress Monastery became Objective Alpha. Next on the list was BADAB Primaris' largest hive city, Hive Dominar. It was the primary civilian administrative hub of the planet, and was also expected to be the main staging point of whatever Tyrant's Legion's troops still remained in the Tyrant service. It was also, of course, by sheer virtue of being a hive city, a heavily fortified and easily defendable position that also boasted significant logistical capabilities. Major arteries of road and maglev travel stretched out from Hive Dominar in every direction. If the enemy was allowed to retreat into its fortified depths, they could easily reorganize, rearm, and muster counterattacks against almost any area for thousands of kilometers around Hive Dominar. The simplest way to prevent this was, of course, to simply smash the hive apart, or at the very least ensure that it was so heavily engaged as to not be a feasible rallying ground for enemy resistance. The cost of engaging in open warfare within a hive city would, of course, mean that the civilian casualties would be catastrophic, reaching into the billions most likely. That is, of course, if there were any civilians left on BADAB Primaris. And Legate Inquisitor Jarndyce Frayne could quite helpfully reassure Karab Cullen that as far as the Imperium was concerned, there were no non-combatants on the planet. Seeing their cue to step in, the Carcharodons volunteered their full chapter might to the completion of this objective. They were quite confident that their battle barge, the Nicor, would be able to open a suitably dramatic path for their entry into Hive Dominar. The rest of the Loyalist commanders had long since learned to not ask any silly questions around the Carcharodons, and so simply just nodded, and assigned Hive Dominar the status of Objective Beta. The third, and possibly most prestigious and valuable of all the objectives, would be the Palace of Thorns, Luft Huron's imperial abode. It was surrounded by the majority of the anti-orbital defenses, and so whichever chapter took on the duty of assaulting it would also be dedicating one of their vessels to fulfilling the job of the Raptorus Rex, that of being a ginormous pinata, whose primary duty was to soak up punishment for the rest of the Armada. The chapter would also have to assault what was expected to be the single most heavily fortified position on the entire planet, and also quite likely to be the center of Astral Claw's operation, and the headquarters of the tyrant in person, who had demonstrated on the lunar base of Piraeus that he was not to be underestimated. After years and years of warfare, I imagine most of the chapters present would have leapt at the chance of being the one to finally bring the tyrant to justice. Not least of all, Carab Cullen and his own Red Scorpions. But the sad truth was that the old chapters had all been severely mauled by those years of warfare. And so the task fell to the Star Phantoms, who were willing to offer up their capital battle barge, the Memento Mori, as the chief bullet sponge of the invasion. The Memento Mori would also therefore take on the primary responsibility of dueling with the enemy's anti-orbital weaponry, and providing the bulk of the ground assault forces to be launched against the Palace of Thorns. Some 7 companies, 700 Space Marines plus scout elements would form the spearhead. They would begin assaulting and attempting to infiltrate the orbital weapons depots to destroy them from the inside out, easing the burden on their capital vessel. But the Star Phantoms would not have to bear the full burden alone. Every chapter wanted to have some form of representation in this last assault on the enemy's final and foremost of bastions. Heavy assault elements from virtually all the Loyalist chapters would be attached in various numbers, degrees, and roles to the Star Phantoms. Armored spear tips, vindicators, whirlwinds, land riders, assault veterans, terminators, and devastators. This would truly be a unified Loyalist effort to claim the head of Luft Huron. You may be wondering why they simply didn't bombard the Palace of Thorns from orbit. Well, firstly, the palace had been designed to withstand just that kind of punishment. Several void shield barriers were installed, along with significant underground armored bunker complexes. Never mind the fact, of course, that hanging in bombardment orbit above the palace would expose any vessel doing so to a ferocious beating by the orbital defenses. Even if the Loyalist ships could bombard the palace at their leisure, there was no guarantee they could penetrate all the way down into the fortified blockhouses. And even if by some miracle they could, how would they ever truly know that they had claimed the tyrant's life in the middle of all of this? No. His head would have to be claimed personally and manually, the good old-fashioned way, so that the Imperium may never need fear the name of Luft Huron. There was also certainly an element of personal vengeance involved as well. Huron was the great boogeyman, the one that had plunged the entirety of the autonomous zone into chaos and corruption. And more than one Loyalist chapter master wanted it to be his blade that delivered the finishing blow. And as a final element of the assault force against the Palace of Thorn, Legate Inquisitor John Dice Frayne, on behalf of the Triumvirate, also offered up several regiments of inquisitorial stormtroopers, along with armored fist regiments, tanks, support detachments, and eventual Imperial Guard troops, once more primarily penal legion forces, to occupy the palace and the planet in the wake of the Astartes violence. With the battle plans thusly hastily reformed, the Loyalist Armada moved into its new formation, with the Star Phantoms Memento Mori leading the charge. The Secessionists' high orbital guard station, the Old Fortress Monastery, was the first to begin firing on the incoming Armada. Its main battery guns opened up against the series of lighter vessels whilst leaving the memento mori to the main anti-orbital defenses on the planet below. The boarding action swiftly began, but it would take quite some time before the high orbital station's guns could be brought under control. And the Loyalists did not have time to sit around waiting. They had managed to catch the tyrant's forces by as much surprise as possible, considering the time required to move from the outer edges of the system and BADAB Primaris, plus, of course, the sizable engagement near the Ring of Steel. The tyrant's legion was probably still mustering, and they needed to strike now. The Carcharodon's battle barge, the Nicor, moved into orbit just above Hive Dominar. They had not seen fit to inform the rest of Loyalist Command on precisely how they intended to assault the Hive City. Whilst, of course, the primary purpose of a Hive City is to serve as a vast, vertical center for civilian habitation, economy, commerce, trade, and various administrative infrastructure and logistical systems, they are also, by sheer dint of being gargantuan mountains of metal, heavily fortified. And Hive Domina was unlikely to be an exception to that rule. Its mountainous outer layers were expected to be studded with thousands of anti-air batteries. Even for drop pods plummeting towards the Earth at terminal velocity, the sheer enormous quantity of flak they could throw up would be a daunting proposition. And yet an attack from above was the only true alternative, as a ground-based invasion would take time, be slow and ponderous. Not to mention, exposed to further hundreds of artillery batteries, minefields, bastion towers, and high citadel walls that would no doubt be thronged by countless thousands of the Tyrant Legion's soldiers. I suspect part of the reason why no one objected to leaving such a valuable objective in the hands of a near-unknown Carcharodon's chapter was because no one else wished to bear the butcher's bill of seizing it. Assaulting the Palace of Thorns was one thing. At least there Astartes could die with his feet on the ground, Bolter bucking in his gauntlets and chain swords roaring. Not blown apart 1,000 feet in the air without ever seeing the face of your attacker. And the Carcharodons fully agreed. That was no fate for one of the God Emperor's avenging angels, now was it? And so, when their battle barge, the Nicor, hove into low bombardment orbit over Hive Dominus, its belly split open to reveal the titanic plasma destructor weapon hidden within. A single shot vaporized Hive Dominus' outer curtain walls and turned half of the ancient hive into a pouring molten river of metal reduced to slag. Now that their once home had been transformed into a lava-spewing volcano, the Carcharodons reckoned that the Tyrant's Legion personnel manning the anti-aircraft guns were suitably distracted for the immediate time being. And swift on the heels of the devastating plasma attack came hundreds of drop pods and Thunderhawk gunships, roaring down into the atmosphere to deliver their grey-armoured warriors of death into the heart of the half-melted slag pile that was once Hive Dominus. The Carcharodons then set about doing what they did best: close-up butchery with chain axes and bolters. They swept through the hive, shattering the defenders and butchering civilians and soldiery alike. The first target was obviously the large orbital defense silos in and around Hive Dominus, along with further AAA anti-air artillery, anything that could threaten the next stage of the invasion. This phase was expected to be a blitzing campaign where the Carcharodons would have all of the enemy overrun within half an hour. But 30 minutes came and 30 minutes went. It took a full hour, twice the allotted time, for the Carcharodons to finally winkle out the last of the resistance manning the heavy anti-aircraft guns near the crown of the spire. But once this was done, Legio Crucius considered the approach safe enough to begin the landing of their war machines. Oh yes, whilst even an Astartes may be sacrificed, blown out of the sky if it meant taking an objective, the guard machines of the Adeptus Mechanicus were not so expendable. Descending on vast engine blocks, many of them the equal of smaller void-faring vessels, the Titan's landing ships slowly, oh so slowly, crawled their way down out of orbit. Each engine expending a tremendous amount of energy, enough to power entire settlements for years, merely to cushion the titanic god machine's descent. It would take an hour before the war machines of Legio Crucius would be ready to walk. Guards require a great deal of ritual after all. But once the black and white armored war machines of the Legio could march alongside the Carcharodons, what little organized resistance remained shattered. The combat had been going on for 2 full hours now. The Carcharodons were supposed to be in the process of wrapping up the last of the resistance and cracking open the more stubborn fortified blockhouses with the aid of Crucius. And yet the grey-armed Astartes were still engaged with the Tyrant's Legion in running street battles throughout the Hive. Whilst crashing into the crown of the Hive City, the Vox network had been decapitated within the first few minutes of the assault. The powerful radiation created by blasting a hole in the Hive City also made all but the most hardened Vox networks nigh on inoperable. And the Carcharodons also took particular interest in seeking out all officers, individual soldiers, non-coms, or anyone seemingly taking the initiative to reorganize the resistance and cutting short their efforts. But the Legion simply would not surrender. Whilst they could not coordinate, they could not organize, they could not communicate, they moved throughout the Hive in small combat squads, aided by a few armored vehicles, chimeras for close-in support, Lehman Russ battle tanks, though scarce, were still in the Legion's arsenal. They were even beginning to set up improvised bombardment positions, utilizing basilisks, medusas, mortars, anything they had. By the 3rd hour, the Carcharodons should be preparing to leave the Hive City after having thoroughly crushed any potential for a large-scale counter-offensive. But they were still fighting. It would be an overstatement to say that the Tyrant's Legion were putting up truly effective resistance. Scattered, unable to talk to one another or offer mutual support, the smaller squads and battle groups were easy prey for the Astartes as they prowled through the ruins. Their superior armor, firepower, and sensors, along with their God Emperor given gifts, granting them a near unassailable advantage. Nevertheless, the blue uniformed men and women of the Tyrant's Guard refused to surrender, refused to lay down their arms in despair or stop fighting. By the 4th hour, it was becoming eminently clear that the Carcharodons were going to have to murder every single one of them, and any hope that they would be able to disengage and aid the rest of the Loyalists in their attempt upon the Palace of Thorns had long since disappeared. Not that the Star Phantoms had ever intended to wait for such aid regardless. They, not having the firepower of the Nikor, launched their assault via drop pod and Thunderhawks directly down on top of the Palace of Thorns. Or more correctly, on top of the vast, sprawling external defensive networks located outside of the main void shield-protected palace. Kilometers of razor wire, bunkers, dugouts, redoubts, and heavy weapons positions covered every approach up to the palace itself, which oversaw it all with its own artillery, heavy weaponry, las cannon, batteries, and bolter positions. It could not be breached directly, its curtain walls too tall, too thick, and too well protected by multiple void shield generators. The only way of cracking open the palace was by slamming down into the outer defenses, taking them meter by meter by meter, and then breaching the curtain walls up close with concentrated Devastator bombardments, Vindicator fire, and satchel charges, and then storming through the bloody breach and further on into kill corridors, dead ends, traps, and automated gun positions. It was going to be a dark day. 700 Star Phantoms descended on wings of fire, storming down towards the surface of BADAB Primaris. A blitzing thunderstorm of fire reached up to greet them. 200 Battle Brothers would die before even the first white armored boot would be planted on BADAB soil. Wasting no time, for to do so would be suicide, the Phantoms stormed into the leading edge of the enemy defenses, taking bunkers and trench lines wherever they could, slaughtering the Tyrant's Legion forces stationed there, and pushing deeper into the defenses, only to have hidden sally ports open up behind them, disgorging Astral Claws combat squads directly into their rear, cutting down dozens of Star Phantoms. Speed would not win this battle, and rushing ahead was as lethal as staying put. A meticulous, systematic advance would be needed, the Star Phantoms discovering hidden gun positions and bunkers, destroying them with Devastator fire, moving into the shattered remnants, and then on to the next bunker, and the next, clearing sally ports and hidden traps as they went, eventually encountering dummy positions, made out to appear like regular bunkers, but when the Star Phantoms burst in, vast detonation charges hidden in the floor or ceiling would be set off, killing, maiming, and wounding yet further of the brave Astartes. And just as they thought they were gaining a good foothold, the Tyrant replayed a strategy used in the Piraeus system. Spacious underground garages dotted the outer defenses. Inside, land raiders, razorbacks, and rhinos loaded down with assault squads rested, awaiting the word to launch their own counter-thrust into the Star Phantoms' lines. They would seize ground only to be overrun by rapidly moving armored columns, losing 100 meters that had been bought with the blood of countless brothers. But if the Tyrant had hoped to sweep the Phantoms clear from the slopes of his fortress, he was to be disappointed. The broken, cratered, and rocky ground now offered excellent concealment for Phantom's Devastator squads, and the lumbering metal monsters of the Astral Claws were easy prey. Barreling out of their often burning transports, the Claws' assault squad swiftly engaged the destroyers of their vehicles. Counter-assaults were met by yet further counterattacks, Those met by yet further sallies again and again, until the slope beneath the Palace of Thorns was a confused jumble, where neither side was entirely sure where the front line ran, or if there even was one any longer. Small groups, kill squads, or even individual Astartes roamed the shattered bunkers and blasted dugouts, hunting for enemies and hoping to rejoin friends. The fighting had been some of the heaviest in the Star Phantom's long and storied history. The first hour in particular was the worst. 200 Marines lost to ground fire alone was the tale of apocalyptic legends, and hundreds more were sacrificed as the chapter clawed its way, meter by scarred, blood-soaked meter, up the hill towards the palace, where it sat embedded in the very side of a mountain. And it looked for a time as if the tale of the Star Phantoms would end right here, in the shadow of that hateful monolith. But thanks to the efforts of their 2 companies dispatched against the High Guard Station, things were beginning to look a little better. With the orbital fortress guns eventually silenced, the Loyalist fleet were willing to risk more of their vessels. Strike cruisers from the other Loyalist chapters were dipping in closer to the Palace of Thorns, dispatching their own reinforcements, and all the chapters had pooled their first company veteran Terminator elites into a unified striking force. Homing in on teleport signals planted by the Star Phantoms wherever was relatively safe. Terminators from the Salamanders, the Red Scorpions, the Sons of Medusa, the Firehawks, all the Loyalist chapters emerged in blasts of displaced air and began moving forward, using their near invulnerable dreadnought armor to clear the way where the mere power-armored Star Phantoms were being butchered. With the aid of the assault specialists, greater and greater openings could be cleared in the palace's outer defenses. Soon, bulk landers carrying their own land raiders with yet further armored reinforcements from the other chapters could begin to make their way down to the surface. With the applications of Vindicators, Predators, Whirlwinds, and numerous Dreadnoughts, the scales were beginning to slowly tip. As the Carcharodons were completing some of their initial objectives as well, yet further orbital defense silos in and near Hive Dominus also fell silent, allowing the bigger, bulkier, slower, and more vulnerable mass transportation landers of the Imperial Guard and Inquisitorial Stormtroopers to make their way down to the surface. The Inquisition's private army were amongst the best armed, armored, led, and trained troops in the whole of the Imperium of Man, and yet here they were as children caught amidst the quarrel of giants. Thousands died just trying to make planetfall. That number only rose as they had to cover all the ground already seized by the Star Phantoms. But unlike the Astartes, the Stormtroopers did not have the advantage of ceramite-clad power armor to protect them from the non-stop hailstorm of high-explosive shells bursting above their heads and showering lethal shrapnel down upon them. And when they finally made it to the cutting edge of the Astartes' advance, their only thanks was to be sent forth alongside the Space Marines into an environment that even they struggled to survive. Even though the Loyalists' heavy assault elements were now in place, armor, dreadnoughts, and terminators, the advance had almost ground to a complete halt. The thin forward wedge of the Loyalist assault had pushed up to within a dozen meters of the curtain walls. But here they could go no further. Any attempt to cross the last distance and begin climbing the walls themselves were met with a torrent of firepower, the likes of which not even the Terminators could withstand. All assault attempts had been inevitably forced to the ground, and despite trying to cling on to whatever ground could be gained, they were swiftly dislodged by roving spearheads of Astral Claw's armored support, dreadnoughts stalking the ruins, dueling with their loyalist counterparts. Predators and land raiders engaged in point-blank duels, where a fraction of a second was the difference between victory and joining the ranks of burning wrecks littering the field. In an attempt to break the impasse, Carab Cullen once again changed the Loyalists' battle plans. Originally, the Titans of Legio Crucius would assist the Carcharodons until Hive Dominar had been fully subjugated. If the Loyalists were struck in the rear now by an organized assault by either Astral Claws or Tyrant's Legion forces, they would be trapped between the Palace of Thorns and their rearward assailants, and almost certainly annihilated. This was why Hive Dominar, which lay only a few dozen kilometers away, was such a precious objective. But the havoc caused by the Carcharodons seemed likely to prevent any such riposte. And the palace was threatening to annihilate the attackers all by itself. A portion of Legio Crucius' heaviest war machines, the Reaver Titans, would be dispatched from Hive Dominar, along with a special assault contingent from the Sons of Medusa. The Iron Hands Offspring chapter would dedicate the majority of their assault terminators equipped with storm shields to break through the breach hammered into the walls by the Reaver Titans. At least that was the thought. The Reavers laid their gun sights upon the citadel walls and unleashed firepower enough to devastate entire armies. Yet the arcane void shield generators of the palace held strong. They resisted every volley, deflected every strike. The Sons of Medusa Terminators, already on the ground, ready for the breach, were starting to suffer casualties themselves, as the enemy identified the threat they made to the walls. A hole had to be hammered home immediately, lest the cream of the Sons of Medusa be wasted for no gain. One of the Reaver Titans, impatient with a lack of progress, strode forward to deliver a near point-blank range volley. Las cannon shots whined off its void shield generators. Predator battle cannon solid shells smashed and hammered apart upon impacting with its meter-thick armor. The Reaver charged up its weaponry and looked on the cusp of delivering the blow that would finally allow the Loyalists in, when an expertly hidden conversion beamer struck out from the Palace of Thorns, catching the Reaver a midriff and tearing it nigh in half. The mechanical musculature, the hydraulic systems, and all the motive force of the Reaver struggled desperately to keep itself aloft. But it began to break, to bend, to tilt, and then to fall, slamming into the bunker fields outside the palace, becoming yet one more corpse amongst the tens of thousands that already littered the slopes. Subsequently, after having seen one of their numbers brought low, the Titans of Legio Crucius backed off. They would maintain a distant bombardment of the defensive ground and bunker complexes outside of the palace, but Crucius would not risk another war machine. The Sons of Medusa Terminators also withdrew, as did the Star Phantoms, the Inquisitorial Stormtroopers, and the majority of the Loyalist forces. They would continue to hunker down in the smashed open bunkers, but any further attempt on the palace would be abandoned, at least for this day. If any amongst the Loyalist High Command had been so foolish to think that they could end this war now, In one good day of heavy fighting, they had had their illusions most thoroughly shattered. The brass of the Loyalist command structure came together to discuss how to proceed the next day, how the problem of the palace should be approached. Perhaps a massed orbital bombardment, but then again, if the palace's void shields had been able to stand up to the combined firepower of Legio Crucius's Reaver Titans, it was unlikely that the Loyalists could bring enough orbital guns to bear to bring them down, particularly as a significant portion of the enemy's anti-orbital defenses was still operational. On that note, the absence of the Carcharodon's chapter master was quite noticeable. The space sharks were still engaged in slaughtering the defenders of Hive Dominus and had not been heard from since the beginning of the action. Legio Crucius could offer precious little in the form of updates on the matter. Their titans had wandered the Hive, smashing apart resistance and leaving burning wrecks of buildings, of vehicles, of armor, and the smoldering remains of Tyrant Legion's troops wherever they had found them. But bestriding the earth like a god, like the Principes did, it was easy to lose sight of the tactical situation. The Carcharodons were, regardless, engaged in their own actions, and did not see particularly fit to inform the Principes of them either, beyond calling for fire support here and there. And that would probably have to be the answer to the problem of the palace as well. The Loyalists would gather all of their remaining might. The Inquisitorial Stormtroopers would join in alongside the Space Marines. The Sons of Medusa, the Firehawks, the Star Phantoms, the Red Scorpions, the Minotaurs, each and every one of the chapters would be lined up and hurled at the palace, hoping that it broke before they did. There was a discussion about whether or not the Carcharodons should also be requested to join the force now being levied against the Tyrant's last stronghold, but it was eventually decided that whatever they were doing, they were best left to it. They still could not, after all, afford the Tyrant's Legion to be able to reform and strike at the Loyalists' backs. The enemy at the front was more than enough, thank you very much. And indeed, aboard the Nicor, the air of frustration found at the Loyalist High Command conclave could also be felt heavy in the air. The Carcharodons had put their pride in gutting the Hive. They had deployed their most devastating weaponry, and yet the insolent human vermin persisted. Very well then. The Carcharodons never let go of a kill, and if the prey's throat could not be torn open at the teeth of a chain blade, there were other ways to kill a Hive city. Meanwhile, down on the planet below, whilst most of the Loyalist Astartes had withdrawn to prepare for the next day's trials, the Imperial Guard, Inquisitorial Stormtroopers, and Titans of Legio Crucius continued fighting throughout the night, across various other hives and settlements on the surface of BADAB Primaris, as well as combat continuing unabated for the Carcharodons in Hive Domina. Though their purpose was no longer the mere hunting down and destruction of small groups of Tyrant's Legion, as they had indeed found another way. Their orders, passed on to them by the War Council and Lord Commander Carab Cullen, had been to attack and destroy the planet's infrastructure, to prevent organized resistance from taking hold in Hive Dominus, and be launched against the relatively unprotected backs of the Loyalists besieging the Palace of Thorns. To adequately achieve this objective, the Carcharodons now decided that it was time to broaden their interpretation of the orders. The dozens of combat teams scattered throughout Hive Dominar began to congregate. Some would remain on the upper layers, near the surface strata of the Hive, hunting down the Tyrant's Legion's remnants that still prowled the ruins in their hundreds and their thousands, to ensure that there was no hope they could possibly reorganize properly. The rest would begin to delve deeper into the Hive, heading towards its center, and then taking the mass conveyors and transit routes into the depths, into the Underhive, into the armored abdomen of Hive Dominar. The resistance here was surprisingly light. The Tyrant's Legion had clearly been deployed to maximize their ability to withstand an outside invasion, hoping to destroy as many of the invaders as possible in the air, where they were relatively helpless. If Hive Dominar had been able to follow the example of the Palace of Thorns, that would have absolutely been the best strategy. But the Tyrant did not account for the Carcharodons keeping so many of their cards close to their chest. This left an object of near supreme importance to the entirety of the planet exposed, however. Presumably protected by the insanity that would be required to mess with it. But insanity was something the Carcharodons had in ample supply, as the combat teams were making their way towards the central reactor chambers of Hive Dominar. Operating Hive City requires a monumental amount of energy, and so at the center of near every such city lies a towering series of plasma reactors, long lost and near forgotten technology whose true potential can only be guessed at. Even if the Maguses of Angstrom had been consulted and brought down to investigate the machines, they would almost certainly have been unable to make either heads nor tails of it. Besides, the Carcharodons had not come for an archaeological expedition. Sweeping aside the paltry resistance of the Tyrant's Legion and the haphazard, half-confused opposition of various Underhive dwellers, the Carcharodons' demolition teams set to work, undermining the Titanic stacks, placing demolition charges on plasma vents, preparing to rupture key components and cause the build-up of pressure within the gigantic vessels. They were not seeking to demolish the machinery, they were seeking to build up even more power and leave it with no escape, no way out, no way to vent. And as the cavernous ceiling above them, the literal caves of steel upon which the entire hive structure rested, began to shake, began to rupture, and began to collapse, the Carcharodons began their escape, sending perfunctory instructions to other Imperial forces engaged within the hive that they should follow their example. It would take quite some time yet before the full scale of the Carcharodons' plans, wanton destruction seems more apt of a term, frankly, would come to light. For now, the immediately observable effect of severing the plasma generators from their conduits was that many of the anti-orbital defense silos across the planet began to fall silent, and the void shield generators surrounding the Palace of Thorns also flickered and died out for but the briefest of moments. Just enough time for the Loyalists to seize the initiative, They had been organizing and gathering up for a renewed offensive against the palace when the opportunity came. Every Titan weapon, every artillery battery, every whirlwind, every tank cannon, every heavy weapon, las cannons, plasma cannons, all of it opened up immediately, subjecting the curtain walls to a cascade of destruction. Force enough to incinerate armies was unleashed on the walls in a matter of minutes. Deprived of the warping, energy-sapping powers of the void shields, they were now nothing more than permacrete, plascrete, and reinforced structures. Sturdy, able to stand up to the force of the explosions for a brief period. But ships were beginning to appear, cracks were being hammered, soon the weight of the walls began to work against them, and a huge breach collapsed outwards, creating a ramp up which the Star Phantoms were the first to clamber as quickly as their power-armored forms could drive them. As the previous day, the Astral Claws reacted immediately, launching attacks against the breach. The Tyrant himself was said to be spotted on multiple occasions, hurling back assault teams, slaughtering Terminators, and tearing apart armored vehicles as they tried to crest the breach. But with the breach made, widening it was a relatively easy task. More and more holes were punched. A breach was claimed by the Sons of Medusa, another by the Star Phantoms, a third by the Firehawks, through which more and more loyalist troops flooded into the courtyards, into the bastions, and into the palace itself. The Astral Claws, pushed on every side, had no hope but to retreat within the armored bulwarks of the palace, slamming shut doors, opening up with weapon batteries, and turning the courtyards outside into yet another casualty-strewn abattoir, running with the blood of Astartes and Inquisitorial stormtroopers alike, intermingling with the heretical fluids of the Astral Claws and their scant handful remaining loyal servants. The inner workings of the palace were almost as heavily fortified as the outer areas, but the Carcharodon's mischief had begun to become far more obvious, as the tremendous amount of energy released deep within the hive was having an effect upon the planet's tectonic core. Hive Domina was turned into now a literal volcano, with most of it falling and cascading down into a massive rent torn in the earth. The Palace of Thorns was similarly rocked nearby, massive rents torn in the ground and the walls of the palace through which the Loyalists stormed. The meticulously prepared defenses of the Astral Claws, the choke points, the kill corridors, the traps, the automated gun positions, all of it began to fail, as the entire structure was rent asunder by the force of a planet tearing itself apart. For the second time during the battle for the palace, everything descended into maddened chaos, as squads stalked the palace back and forth, looking for enemies, looking for friends, looking for points of reference, which were swiftly swallowed by gaping holes torn in the earth. The claws themselves were beginning to fall back, surrendering more and more of the upper areas, pulling deeper into the catacombs beneath the palace. Huron was seen fleeing down one of these pathways, and the Star Phantom's captain, Zrukel Androcles, headed in after him. For long, painful minutes, the two groups switched long-range bolter-fire up and down winding stairs, through pillar-strewn corridors, into the deeper depths of the palace. until finally Androcles and his veteran assault squad managed to close the distance and engage the tyrant and his personal guard in a brutal back-and-forth melee that flooded through dozens of halls, both sides gaining and losing the advantage, pushing the other back, breaking free, retreating, launching yet further assaults, ripostes. The two sides slashing, dueling, hammering, shooting, blasting, throwing grenades, crack bombs, blasting open new paths with melter charges. The running skirmish continued unabated. A Star Phantom cut down an astral claw in a point-blank range of bolter fire before being eviscerated by a slash from the tyrant's lightning claws. Finally seeing his opportunity to engage the beast one-on-one, Captain Androcles stepped in and engaged the tyrant. Swinging with his relic power sword, the tyrant dodged out of the way, riposting with his lightning claws. The captain jumped back, both sides trying to draw bead on the other with their weapons. Huron with his flamethrower, the captain with his stormbolter. But neither combatant was complacent enough to ever be caught by the other's fire. Blasting, tearing chunks out of the masonry, the two danced around one another, exchanging blows time and time again. The tyrant had been fighting for 2 whole days, and Androcles had hardly had it any easier, and both were near the limits of their endurance even as superhuman space marines. The tyrant, however, had been fighting for even longer than the captain of the Star Phantoms, and had measured his worth against Carab Cullen. His Terminator armor provided him the final advantage. Baiting Androcles to lose a near point-blank burst of bolter fire that would have instantly slain any other foe, the dreadnought plate dissipated the storm of shells, protecting the tyrant for just long enough for him to deliver a vicious slash across the captain's torso, sending him sprawling onto his back, mortally wounded. But as the tyrant strode over to finish him and add another loyalist scalp to his belt, brave Captain Androcles, summoning the last of his strength from his shattered, torn open body, raised his bolter and triggered the combi melter weapon. Even the tyrant's armor could not possibly hope to protect him from a point-blank blast by an anti-tank weapon like that. But with reflexes honed over centuries of warfare, the tyrant raised his relic claw, and the melter beam impacted upon it. Its energy fields blaring, blasting, and struggling against the forces, overloading, exploding, and sending the tyrant flying back, arm one way, body the other. The remaining Star Phantoms rushed forward to recover the body of their captain, and the Astral Claws did the same. The two sides parted, both desperate to preserve the lives of their leaders, and besides, the planet was beginning to make any further combat impossible, as the palace was buckling and breaking apart. Even here in the deepest, most reinforced sections, rents and entire segments of the roof and floor was collapsing and caving away. The Loyalists began a pell-mell haphazard retreat, rushing back to their landing crafts, their Thunderhawks and Bulklanders. The Inquisitorial Stormtroopers and Astartes alike evacuated the planet as molten magma began streaming up from bursting vents in the ground. The combat now became a ferocious struggle to escape. Loyalists and secessionists alike trying to commandeer anything that could fly and take them out up into orbit. Groups of Astral Claws punched through the enemy siege lines, taking advantage of the confusion to steal Loyalist transports and escape the battle. The Loyalists themselves raided the Astral Claws' underground armories for their transports. Civilian vessels too were seized en masse. The only ones that were able to retreat in any form of an organized manner were the Carcharodons. And even as the planet buckled and broke apart, its atmosphere filled with ash and toxic gas, making auspex and sensorium equipment near useless, the fight moved on into orbit. With no control over who was occupying what or operating which transport, Loyalist vessels found themselves boarded by small groups of astral claws, desperate to seize all means of conveyance out of the system. Loyalist transports were destroyed by their own blocking ships, fearful that the incoming Thunderhawks were not at all what they claimed to be. In the absolute confusion, Loyalist ships fired on other Loyalists. Astral Claw's boarding parties invaded vessels and tried to take them over. Loyalist counter-boarding parties hammered into the hulls of ships still under their control, slaughtering dozens of the crew before realizing their mistake. Such was the absolute nature of the confusion, it took 2 full days before a semblance of order was finally re-established. The extent of the damage could nearly only be guessed at, and it would take several more days before it could be fully evaluated. As for the secessionists, no one knew. At least one warp-capable vessel, presumed to have some 200 secessionists aboard, had warped out of the system just the day before. How many others was unclear, and probably something no one will ever truly know or learn. I imagine a certain "I'm helping" meme here with a Carcharodon attached to it. I'm not entirely convinced the rest of the Loyalist War Council were quite so overjoyed at the Space Shark's efforts, but it was now also entirely undeniable that the war for BADAB was finally over. BADAB Primaris had fallen. It was in the hands of the Loyalists, though it wasn't much to hold on to any longer. The civilian populace were expected to all have been completely eradicated now, as world-ending storms and cataclysmic geothermal activity continued to rend the planet asunder, and would do so for many weeks and months thereafter. But again, nevertheless, the system was theirs. It had been seized, and the last vestige of secessionist resistance had, at least insofar as anyone cared to look, been crushed. The Legate Inquisitor and the Triumvirate declared it mission accomplished. Now all that remained was the paperwork. There was the trial and the punishment of the other Warders chapters, still to be seen to, of course, and the executioners. Let us not forget about them. There were also rewards to be handed out. Frayne had made certain promises to entice the aid of the Carcharodons and the Star Phantoms. And we will of course cover that in one last video this weekend. For now, the war is over. The Loyalists are triumphant. Carab Cullen has brought the conflict to a successful end and revenged the fall of his chapter master. Or has he? Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.